right, good afternoon, everybody. This is your lecture on Eisenhower's foreign policy. That is Jerry Lee Lewis, whole lot of shaking going on from right around the same time. Let's see, where are we? Eisenhower's foreign policy is the name of this lecture. 1952 to 60, he's president. That is a campaign button. I like Ike when he ran in 1952. When he ran again in 1956, they changed it to say, I still like Ike. I'm going to cover the following things. I'm going to skip the ending of the Korean War, but that is something Eisenhower was responsible for, and you should think of that when you think his foreign policy. I'll tell you who the key players were: his nuclear policy, the domino theory, peaceful coexistence, Sputnik and the space race, and the U-2 incident. That makes up today's lecture. Key players are that man, and that man. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the president, former general and the leader of the commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. Also held a number of other positions within the Army, but was never held to elective office or held elective office before running for president in 1952. Kind of like Donald Trump today. His Secretary of State was the man in the middle, John Foster Dulles, very famous, and their rival was the USSR's premier, the leader, Nikita Khrushchev, who had succeeded Joseph Stalin, who had passed away finally early in, I think, 1951, something around that time. After the Korean War, nuclear arms and the nuclear arms race emerged as the key point of tension between the U.S. and the USSR, and this went on for a long time. The nuclear arms race, of course, began well before Eisenhower was president, back in 1945, when Truman decided to drop the 2 atomic bombs in Japan, ending World War II. The Soviets shocked us in 1949 by achieving their own nuclear weapon 4 years later. That was much sooner than we thought it would take them. By 1952, we had developed a hydrogen bomb, much more powerful, and the Soviets, it appeared, were catching up to us because it only took them one more year to get their own hydrogen bomb. And so what you have is this element, definitely a race to see who could have the advantage and the military advantage and who could stay on top. And a lot of fear that if we didn't stay on top, we would be threatened by the menacing Soviet Union. In 1954, Dulles announces a policy of massive retaliation, which I will explain on the next slide. In 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite in space, Sputnik 1, and that is not technically a nuclear event, but it does push space technology, missile technology out into space, and that is going to push nuclear arms race into another level. And then by 1959, the U.S. had developed the first real ICBM. And ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. So we could now send missiles which could be armed with nuclear weapons in the tip from continent to continent. And the Soviets follow with that very soon. And the 60s is thus going to be even more dangerous than the 50s were. That's a nuclear arms race from 45 to 60. What was our nuclear policy under Eisenhower with these threats arising? Strangely enough, you might think that the policy would be, hey, let's avoid using them wherever possible. Dulles and Eisenhower actually respond with the opposite policy of massive retaliation. This is the verbatim excerpt from a Dulles speech. We need allies and we need collective security. Our purpose is to make these relations more effective and less costly. This can be done by placing more reliance on deterrent power and less dependence on local defensive power. He's saying, let's worry less about having armies in place, say, in Germany to protect against an invasion by the East Germans or by the Soviets. Let's just have a lot of nuclear weapons. There's no local defense which alone will contain the mighty land power of the communist world, the Soviet Union. Local defenses must be reinforced by the further deterrent of massive retaliatory power. A potential aggressor must know that he cannot always prescribe battle conditions that suit him. So this is the idea that nuclear weapons can deter the Soviets from acting aggressively militarily. What goes along with this is the idea of MAD, or mutual assured destruction. Because nuclear weapons were becoming more and more powerful and more dangerous, we feared that we would actually use them again. And so the deterrent, the way to deter each side from using it, became this doctrine of, well, let's make them so bad and so violent and powerful and destructive that neither side will launch, because we know if they launch against us, we have the power to launch back against them before we were destroyed, and we'll inflict massive damage on both of us. So with that kind of situation, since we are mutually assured of destroying each other, neither side will launch. And that doctrine, as crazy as it seems, is actually the doctrine that both sides followed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, until the end of the Cold War. That is an image of a nuclear missile being launched, or tested, a test launch, from Vandenberg Air Force Base, about maybe an hour from where I lived in California, off to go into the Pacific Ocean. The next item of Eisenhower's foreign policy is the domino theory. And that's a nice cartoon. You can take a look at it and come back to it later if you want. During a 1954 press conference, a reporter asked Eisenhower, "Mr. President, would you mind commenting on the strategic importance of Indochina for the free world? I think there has been across the country some lack of understanding on just what it means to us." Indochina is there. It's what became Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In 1954, it was a French colony, and the French were losing control of it, and communist rebels were getting power in the area of North Vietnam up here. And 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu right there is taking place. So here is Eisenhower's response. He talks about the economic importance of Indochina for rubber and other things. He talks about the second thing of, wanting to make sure that the Vietnamese people were free, which we actually didn't really care about. And then he came to the most important consideration. Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one. What will happen to the last one is a certainty that it will go over very quickly. You could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. He later in the speech said this disintegration will lead to the loss of Indochina, of Burma, of Thailand, of the Malay Peninsula, and Indonesia following. And then beyond, even to India. And that's that cartoon. And there you see the fear that, well, if Vietnam turns communist, so will the countries next to it, maybe even Thailand. Burma is there to the, you can't see my hand, here to the left. And then Malaysia is down here and Indonesia to the south. And that was a very sincere fear, probably overblown, but that led to the domino theory. We go back to something I've emphasized a lot, is that the lessons of the 30s and 40s dealing with Hitler, Mussolini, the Japanese, and the fascists is appeasement doesn't work. It only leads to dictator grabbing for more. The domino theory is what we learned from Hitler. We just applied it to different places. So for the 30 years after World War II, we followed the almost opposite strategy of containment, which we learned about in class, opposing and limiting communist dictatorships everywhere. So even countries of little real importance seemed important to us. Korea, which you could argue because it was so close to Japan, had real importance. Vietnam, and all across the globe, we fought in these places that seemed very remote, but under the domino theory, we cared about communism advancing anywhere. So that's the domino theory. By 1955, the tensions of the Cold War and nuclear problems or fears led to this realization that, hey, maybe we all don't want to destroy ourselves. And the Soviets first promoted the idea of, look, you're capitalist and we're communist, but maybe we don't have to destroy each other. And so the idea of peaceful coexistence, of not agreeing with each other, but allowing the other side to exist, came into being in the mid-50s. And in 1955, Khrushchev there on the right, Ike on the left, and a few other leaders met in Switzerland for a summit meeting, not because they met in the mountains of the Alps, but because it was a meeting of the top leaders of the world. And so that's the first idea of peaceful coexistence. And during the Cold War, there are going to be these risings, that's a poor way to put it, rise and fall of tension. And it's going to go up and down several times. So this is the first time they try and kind of back off. That backing off doesn't last too long, in part because of Sputnik. Sputnik, as I mentioned earlier, is launched in October of 1957. It is launched by the Soviets. It is a first artificial satellite in space. It is a small ball, about the size, metal ball about the size of a beach ball, with 4 radio antennas that sent messages back to the Earth, which didn't really mean anything, but it was just the very fact that they'd been able to launch something into space and then it orbited the Earth was very alarming to America. Soviets fire Earth satellite into space, 18,000 miles per hour, and that leads to the space race, so the effects of Sputnik. In October 57, you get the launch of Sputnik. Just a month later, the Russian dog Laika gets launched into space. And so now you have live animals, live beings being launched into space. That's actually a very sad story. Laika was a street dog. They pulled off the streets of Moscow and they took him because they figured a street dog would be tougher than a pet dog. And they proclaimed Laika a hero when she went up into space, and they said she died a peaceful death from lack of oxygen, but that was not actually true. Laika burned up from the intense heat of the launch. In direct response to Sputnik, in 1958, NASA is created, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to promote research and development of rocketry and exploration of space and the atmosphere. 1961, America is shocked again that the Soviets beat us. Yuri Gagarin, the man on the right, is the first human to orbit in space. And he, unlike Laika, made it back alive and was an incredible hero in the Soviet Union. That, of course, launches John F. Kennedy's race to the moon. And by the end of the decade, Neil Armstrong and the Americans had landed on the moon. The effects of Sputnik are, in part, sparking the space race, but it also creates tremendous anxiety in the U.S., and the whole next slide I'll talk about that. What's the anxiety due to? Well, now it's clear that the USSR is not just catching up to us, but now has a head start into space. And there's a fear that by being able to launch satellites into space, they may be able to also use that as a way to attack us, so weapons in space, which was not something that either side could do, but the fear was that potentially they could. And now there's anxiety that the U.S. is behind technologically. And so there's an alarm that we're behind educationally. Do we have enough engineers and scientists? So I always say the reason you take so much math and science and that there's so much testing originally starts way back with Sputnik in 1957, that it sparked a backlash that our schools and our educational system were behind. And it is from this point forward that you see massive, dramatic federal spending on space technology and technology in general and engineering. And this is when the major research universities of the country begin to really get a lot of federal funding, often for military-related projects. This is when Stanford begins to grow, when UC Berkeley begins to grow, when the University of Michigan and Harvard and a lot of other places around the country get massive amounts of funding. And for example, it was really Defense Department spending that gets the initial seed money for Silicon Valley. and the schools begin to really emphasize, hey, everybody's got to take a lot of math, a lot more science. And I really fundamentally believe that is why you are taking things like Algebra 2 trig now, even though some might argue that is too much math for many of you. That's a different debate. We'll close this out with the last incident of Eisenhower's presidency, the U-2 incident. 2 weeks before another summit in Paris, that type of plane, a U-2, happened in May 1960. It was a U-2 spy plane. It was shot down over the Soviet Union. The aircraft was being flown by the CIA, a man named Francis Gary Powers, and he was taking photographs from very high altitude of Soviet bases and military installations and things. A missile, Soviet missile, surface-to-air missile, shot it down, and he crashed and parachuted out and was captured. The U.S. tried to cover up the plane's purpose and mission, but because they had the pilot and they also had the remains of the plane, including the camera technology and some of the photos of Russian military bases, the fact that the U.S. was illegally spying over Soviet airspace became clear, and eventually the U.S. admitted it. And that led to the kind of end of the warming up of period, cancellation of the summit, and a kind of an abrupt, nasty end to Eisenhower's presidency. And when John F. Kennedy's comes in, the relationship is going to be much more negative. And that's it. That's all we got. Not bad, huh, people? Okay, let's turn this off, and I will see you another